we talk about how we have to be realistic. And sometimes people are criticized for not being so realistic. And of course, when it comes to spiritual matters, when it comes to our aspirations to have a relationship with God, we do have to be realistic. And sometimes we think it's kind of odd when people are not, again, to use that word, realistic enough. Now, the amazing thing is that the Torah teaches us that God also is very realistic in terms of how He perceives us and in terms of His expectations from us. He realizes that we're only humans, and that was the whole beauty of giving the Torah to the world, because God wants human beings to sanctify His name in this world by keeping His word. So in this week's Torah portion, in the book of Leviticus, in the portion of Acharei, we have a very amazing example of how God is really very realistic about who we are in the midst of our humanity, however much we strive to be as close to Him as possible. So in this Torah portion, we have a very vivid description of the procedure of the high priest on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and all of the things that he has to do, the various parts of the service, to bring about atonement for the whole nation. This is chapter 16 in the book of Leviticus, and we're reading all about the atonement that he brings about for the people. And in verse 16, we actually read, "And he shall make atonement for the holy place, because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel, and because of their transgressions in all their sins. And so shall he do for the tent of meeting, that remains among them in the midst of their uncleanness." The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, brings about an atonement, an act of atonement for the Mikdash itself, for the tabernacle, for the tent of meeting, which of course represents the meeting place of the divine, the concentration of holiness in the world. But yet we're told by this verse that it remains among them, amongst the children of Israel, in the midst of their uncleanness. Our sages have a very amazing tradition about this verse, which refers to the tent of meeting as being affected by the uncleanness, as it were, by the state of sin of the children of Israel, that the tent of meeting remains amongst the children of Israel in its uncleanness, that even though the children of Israel may be unclean, even though they may sin and they may stray from God, but yet the divine presence remains among them, even in their state of uncleanness. As this verse indicates, the Kohen Gadol is empowered by God and able to bring about an atonement for the tent of meeting, which remains amongst the children of Israel in its uncleanness. So God would suffer His presence, as it were, to remain with us in this world in a very realistic way, despite the fact that we are unclean. In other words, God is able to bear our iniquity and to deal with our state of sinfulness, which leads to uncleanness, and which could even be thought to somehow bring about some sort of pollution to the divine presence itself. He will risk all that, as it were, and He will dwell amongst us in our state of uncleanness. He knows who we are, He knows we're people, and He desires to be with us in this world, even in a state of sin. However, there is one very interesting insight that the Torah itself teaches us regarding this principle of the divine presence that will be willing to stay with us even in a state of uncleanness, because that doesn't actually go for every sin. It goes for most sins, but there's one particular type of sin which God tells us He cannot abide. And we find in the book of Psalms, in chapter 101, we find a very amazing verse that tells us, in chapter 101, it's actually verse 5, "Whoever secretly slanders his neighbor, him I will cut off. Him that has a high look and a proud heart, I will not suffer." And in Hebrew, the words are actually, for these words that we're translating, "I will not suffer," "Oto lo uchal." Him, I can't bear it. I can't handle it. Literally in Hebrew, I can't do it. In other words, God tells us through the psalmist in this chapter regarding a person who has a proud heart. That person give me anybody else, God says, but I cannot do it. I cannot deal with that person. And as the Talmud tells us, literally, God says about a person who is affected by the sin of haughtiness, of conceit, God says, I and him, there's not enough room for both of us in this world. I can't live in the world with that person because he's kind of like pushing me away. I'm trying to settle down in this world, and he's like pushing my feet away. So God tells us in this verse, him I can't abide. But for everyone else, the verse in this week's portion in Leviticus actually tells us even the tent of meeting itself, the very seat of holiness, in the midst of uncleanness, it's okay. But God says regarding a person of haughtiness, a person of conceit, a person of a proud heart, him I really can't go the distance. And this teaches us a very profound lesson, that the sin of haughtiness, the sin of conceit, of arrogance, is really placed on a scale opposite all of the other character flaws and types of inadequacies that a person can have. And God really feels that everything else is understandable and everything else is something that he can forgive and that we can work on. But when it comes to a person who is arrogant and who is haughty, this person, God says, there's just not enough room in the world for both of us.